The great spires of the Zalarian hegemony did not merely scrape the sky. They pierced the very membrane of the atmosphere, crystalline needles of obsidian and violet light that drew power from the turbulent storms of the gas giant below, anchoring the station in a gravity well that would have crushed lesser constructs into dust. Yet here, in the silence of the High Council chamber, the screaming winds were reduced to a distant, harmonious thrum that vibrated in the floor plates, a constant reminder of the chaos held at bay by superior engineering and ancient intellect. High Chancellor Vrax sat upon his dais, his chitinous plating shifting with a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone, the bioluminescent patterns on his thorax pulsing a slow, rhythmic indigo that signified deep contemplation mixed with an undercurrent of distaste. For the subject at hand was not one of noble diplomacy or high science, but of desperation. A commodity that the hegemony had never needed to barter with until the creeping darkness of the abyssal void began to swallow the outer colonies, leaving nothing but silence and ghost ships drifting in the dark. The chamber was vast, a cavern of polished acoustic stone designed to amplify the whispers of the elite, filled now with the murmuring of 1,000 delegates from 100 subject species, all of them looking toward the center of the room where the holographic projection of a star chart floated, its edges frayed and red where the void had encroached, a rotting infection spreading through the galactic arm. The reports are consistent, High Chancellor. The voice belonged to Sub-Admiral Catho, a reptilian strategist whose scars told of skirmishes in the border worlds. His voice rough, lacking the refined melody of the court. The automated dreadnoughts, the finest AI-piloted vessels in our armada, ceased to function the moment they crossed the event horizon of the rift, their logic cores shattered by the non-Euclidean geometry of that space. And when we send living crews, species with the highest psionic resistance, they return, if they return at all, as husks, their minds wiped clean or worse, filled with a screaming madness that necessitates immediate euthanasia. The Admiral paused, his slit-pupilled eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge his failure before he continued. We have the ships, ancient vessels dredged from the vaults of the precursors, hull plating capable of withstanding the shearing forces, engines that run on singularities, but we do not have the pilots, for to interface with those ships in that region of space is to invite the void into one's soul, and we are creatures of order, of logic, of light. The murmur in the hall grew louder, a wave of anxiety rippling through the gathered alien races, the delicate insecta diplomats fluttering their wings in distress, the heavy-set mineral-based senators grinding their mandibles, for they all knew the implication, they all knew that the trade routes were collapsing, that the hunger of the void was not merely a spatial anomaly but a predatory force, and that their civilization, for all its art and philosophy, was starving to death. Vrax raised a single claw, and the silence was instantaneous, absolute, born of 1,000 years of authoritarian rule. You speak of the precursor vessels, the death ships, Vrax said, his voice a low, resonant hum, machinery designed by a race that went extinct because they delved too deep into the dark, and you propose we actuate them, yet you admit we have no crew capable of enduring the transit, so unless you have summoned spirits from the nether, Admiral, your strategy is void. Catho hesitated, his tail twitching before he keyed a command into his console, and the hologram changed, zooming out from the infected sector to a remote spiral arm of the galaxy, a region known for its instability, its high radiation bursts, its chaotic gravitational shear, a region marked on all charts as interdicted, Class 12 hazards. You do not have the crews within the hegemony, High Chancellor, Catho said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that echoed throughout the vast hall. But there are rumors, whispers from the fringe traders who dare the radiation belts, of a species that evolved in the gravity wells of a death world, a planet where the tectonic plates grind constantly, where the atmosphere is a corrosive mixture of oxidizers, where the predators are relentless and the microbiology is a constant war of attrition. A holographic image of a bipedal creature appeared, unarmored, soft-skinned, lacking claws or venom sacs, looking pitifully fragile against the backdrop of the galactic map. Humans, Vrax spat the word as if it were a curse, the taste of it foul in his mouth, for the Terran Union was a minor power, a collection of scavengers and madmen who clung to their rock in the darkness, refusing to be civilized, refusing to integrate into the hierarchy of the hegemony. You suggest we entrust the salvation of our empire to these primates, creatures who surely barely possess the cognitive capacity to operate a fusion drive, let alone the neural interfaces of a precursor dreadnought. Catho nodded slowly, They are primitive in their aesthetics, yes, and their technology is crude, relying on projectile ballistics and combustion, but they possess a unique trait, High Chancellor. Their neural architecture is scarred. They evolved in chaos. They do not fear the dark because they were born in it. Our spies report that their minds are naturally shielded, not by psionic training, but by a density of trauma and resilience that makes them numb to the very frequencies that shatter our minds. They call it compartmentalization. They can walk through fire and feel only the heat, not the terror. The hall erupted in debate, a cacophony of disbelief and outrage, that the high and mighty hegemony would debase itself to hire mercenaries from a death world, that they would place the priceless ancient ships into the hands of barbarians. But as the debate raged, Vrax looked at the image of the human, at the strange, flat eyes that seemed to stare at nothing and everything at once, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. He saw not a savior, but a tool, a disposable component. If the ships killed them, then the hegemony lost nothing but credits. If they succeeded, the trade routes would be open, and the humans could be disposed of later. Silence! Vrax commanded, the word amplifying until it shook the dust from the high arches. We have no choice. The void approaches. Summon the Terrans. Offer them whatever credits or resources their primitive hearts desire. We will give them the ships. We will let them pilot the vessels of the dead. And if they die in the screaming dark, let it be their burden, not ours. The arrival of the human delegation 3 standard rotations later was an event of underwhelming visuals but overwhelming tension. For the docking bay of the Grand Spire was accustomed to the sleek, silent gliders of the Alari or the massive, ornate barges of the Crag. But the human vessel that tore itself out of warp at the edge of the system was a blocky, ugly thing, covered in ablative armor and bristling with kinetic weaponry that looked like toys compared to the plasma arrays of the station. It docked with a metallic clang that reverberated through the hull, a lack of grace that made the station's flight controllers wince. And when the airlock hissed open, there was no fanfare, no golden light, only the smell of recycled air and ozone. The human representative, a female named Captain Valerie Thorne, stepped onto the pristine white flooring of the docking bay, flanked by 2 guards who looked less like soldiers and more like industrial workers, their armor scuffed and utilitarian, their weapons held with a casual familiarity that was more terrifying than aggressive posturing. Thorne was small compared to the towering Zalarians, her skin pale, her hair cropped short, her eyes scanning the bay not with wonder, but with a cold, tactical assessment that made Vrax, waiting with his entourage, feel suddenly exposed. High Chancellor, Thorne said, her voice amplified by a translator device on her collar, the tone flat, devoid of the obsequious reverence usually offered to him. You called, we came. The transmission said you have a job that's killing your people. You want us to drive. Vrax drew himself up to his full height, his shadow casting long over the humans, trying to assert dominance through sheer scale. It is not merely driving, Captain, he corrected, his voice dripping with condescension. We possess vessels of precursor origin, ships capable of traversing the abyssal void, a region of space where the laws of physics are malleable. Our crews succumb to madness. Your species, originating from a Class 12 death world, is rumored to possess a certain insensitivity to environmental horror. We require you to pilot these ships to the Thanatos sector to retrieve a strategic archive. The payment will be substantial. Thorne didn't blink, didn't look at the datapad of credits being offered by the aide. She looked past Vrax, toward the viewport where the silhouette of the precursor ship, the Omen, hung in space dock, a jagged, dark monolith that seemed to absorb the light of the stars around it. The Omen, Thorne said, recognizing the class of ship, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face, not fear but recognition. We know of these ships. We found one drifting near Jupiter 3 decades ago. We call them sarcophagus class. You want us to take that thing into the void? Vrax smiled internally. The savage was already intimidated. If you are too afraid, Captain, we can seek assistance elsewhere, he bluffed, knowing there was nowhere else. Thorne let out a short, dry sound, a human bark of amusement. Afraid? No, just checking if why. Oh, knew what you were asking. Those ships aren't just transport. They're cages, but the price is right. We'll take the job, but I have one condition. My crew runs the ship. No interference from your observers. They can watch, but they don't touch the controls, and they stay in the shielded bridge. If they wander the halls, what happens to them is on you. Vrax agreed with a dismissive wave of his claw. He had sent his finest scientist, High Inquisitor Calith, to monitor the humans, to learn how their primitive minds resisted the madness, and eventually to see if their resilience could be harvested. The boarding of the Omen was a solemn procession, the Zalarian scientists clad in protective psionic dampening suits, their movements jittery, their sensors screaming warnings about the ambient psychic pressure radiating from the ship's hull, while the humans walked aboard in standard flight suits, carrying duffel bags and thermoses of a steaming brown liquid, chatting idly about sports and weather. Caliph, the High Inquisitor, watched them with a mixture of scientific fascination and horror. He was a being of refined senses, capable of detecting the emotional spectrum of those around him, and from the ship he felt a deep, brooding malevolence, a hunger that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, but from the humans he felt nothing. Or rather, he felt a static wall, a density of mind that refused to reflect the environment. It was as if they were dead inside, or perhaps so full of their own internal noise that the screaming of the universe couldn't get in. As they reached the bridge, a cavernous room of dark metal and floating holographic interfaces that glowed with a sickly green light, Thorne took the captain's chair, a seat clearly designed for a being much larger, and spun it around. "All right, people," she announced, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence of the ship. "Systems check. Johnson, how's the reactor?" "Leaking radiation like a sieve, Captain," a voice called out from the engineering pit. "Shielding is degraded. We'll be cooking within a week if we don't patch it." Thorne shrugged. "Patch it with the lead lining from the cargo bay, create a deadlock. What about the navigation computer?" Another human, a young man with tattoos covering his neck, kicked the console. "It's whispering, Cap, trying to interface with my neural cortex. I isolated the node. It's angry." "Let it be angry," Thorne said, popping the lid of her thermos and taking a sip. "As long as it calculates the jump coordinates. All right, alien friends." She gestured to Caliph and his team, who were huddled in the corner, their dampening fields humming loudly. "Buckle up. The abyssal void is bumpy, and whatever you see out the windows, don't look at it too long. The abyss stares back, and it doesn't like tourists." Caliph wanted to protest, to demand a more rigorous safety protocol, but the ship groaned, a sound like a dying god, and the engines engaged. The transition was not instantaneous like a warp jump. It was a tearing sensation, a feeling of being pulled through a straw, and suddenly the stars were gone. Outside the viewports, there was no blackness of space. There was swirling, impossible color, violets that tasted like copper, greens that sounded like screaming children, a chaotic storm of sensory data that defied logic. Caliph squeezed his eyes shut, his mind reeling, his dampening suit whining as it struggled to filter out the psionic assault. He checked his sensors. The ship was under immense strain. The hull was flexing, but the humans— He opened one eye. Thorne was leaning back in her chair, reading a physical book made of paper. The navigator was chewing gum, tapping a rhythm on his console. They were completely unaffected. "How?" Caliph whispered, his voice trembling. He stumbled forward, gripping the railing of the command deck. "How do you not hear it? The wailing of the lost, the pressure of the infinite?" Thorne looked up from her book, marking the page with a finger. "Hear what? The background noise?" She gestured vaguely at the swirling madness outside. "Inquisitor, on my homeworld, I grew up in a city with 20 million people. The noise never stops. Sirens, shouting machinery, the constant threat of violence. This," she pointed to the window, "this is just weather, bad weather." Caliph stared at her, unable to comprehend. "You equate the psionic dissolution of reality to urban congestion." "I equate survival to adaptability," Thorne said, closing the book. "You people live in a garden. You carefully prune your reality, control your climate, genetically modify your minds to be peaceful. You have no immunity. Earth is a forge. We are hammered into shape. We don't block out the darkness, Inquisitor. We absorb it. We let it flow through us, and we just keep working." She stood up and walked to the main viewport, looking directly into the swirling vortex that had driven Catho. "It's best captains to suicide. But don't mistake our calm for ignorance. We know what this place is, and we know we aren't alone here." As if on cue, a proximity alarm blared, not the standard electronic siren of the hegemony, but a guttural, mechanical roar that the humans had installed. "Contact," the tactical officer shouted. "3 vectors closing fast, biological signatures, massive." Caliph looked at the sensor screen and his blood ran cold. The shapes were not ships. They were leviathans, energetic entities composed of pure hatred and hunger, living storms that hunted in the void. They were the reason no ship returned. "Evasive maneuvers," Caliph shrieked. "We must retreat. We cannot fight ghosts." Thorne didn't even look at him. "Johnson, divert power to the kinetic drivers. Load the tungsten shards. Helmsman, bring us about Vector 229. Let's say hello." The humans moved with a sudden, terrifying synchronization. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a predatory focus. They were not panicking, they were hunting. Caliph realized then the title of the mission dossier was wrong. The humans were not the prey being fed to the void. They were the predators the void had failed to kill. The Omen shuddered as the main cannons fired, not energy beams which would dissipate in the void, but solid slugs of metal, accelerated to a fraction of light speed. The battle was a blur of motion and impossible geometry. The Leviathans lashed out with tendrils of psychic energy that smashed against the hull, causing the lights to flicker and the gravity to reverse momentarily. Calith was thrown against the ceiling, his suit failing, whispers clawing at his mind, telling him to open the airlock to embrace the cold. He saw his fellow scientists clawing at their helmets, screaming. But through the haze of madness, he saw Thorn. She was standing in the center of the bridge, feet planted on the ceiling, which was now the floor, shouting orders that made no sense. Pattern Delta. Vent the coolant into the void. Blind them. The humans were fighting physics with chaos. They were using the ship's malfunctions as weapons. When the coolant vented, it froze instantly into a cloud of jagged crystals, confusing the Leviathan's sensors. The humans fired into the cloud, the rounds tearing through the entity's incorporeal form, causing it to shriek, a sound Calith felt in his bones. Hours or perhaps days later, time had no meaning in the void, the silence returned. The Omen was battered, hull plates groaning, the air smelling of burnt circuitry and copper blood. Calith lay on the deck, exhausted, his mind frayed but intact. He looked up. The humans were cleaning. Someone was sweeping up broken glass. Thorn was back in her chair, nursing a fresh cup of coffee. The Leviathans were gone, dissipated into the ether. "You killed them," Calith whispered, his voice raspy. "Entities of pure energy. You killed them with metal." Thorn looked down at him, her expression somber. "We didn't kill them. You can't kill energy. We just hurt them enough that they decided we weren't worth the meal. That's nature, Inquisitor. Everything wants an easy kill. Humans were never an easy kill." She stood up and offered him a hand. He took it, feeling the calloused skin, the warmth of a living being. For the first time, he did not see a primitive. He saw a titan. "Why?" Calith asked as she pulled him up. "Why do you do this? You knew what was out here, the dangerous ships. You didn't take them because you needed the money. You took them because we're the only ones who can," Thorn finished for him. "The galaxy is a garden, Inquisitor. You built high walls and pretended the jungle didn't exist. But the jungle is always there, and sometimes things climb over the walls. You need someone to stand at the gate. You look at us and see savages from a death world. We look at you and see children playing in a sandbox. Someone has to watch the perimeter." She walked back to the console. "We're coming up on the Thanatos sector. Get your archive. We're not staying long." The arrival at the Thanatos sector was anticlimactic in its visuals but profound in its implications. The colony was dead, a graveyard of frozen spires, but the archive was intact. The humans retrieved it with efficient professionalism, ignoring the frozen bodies of the colonists, ignoring the ghosts that undoubtedly haunted the halls. They treated the dead with respect, but without fear. Calith watched them, his worldview shattered. He realized that the dangerous ships were not dangerous because of the technology. They were dangerous because they went to places where civilization could not survive. And the humans were the ferrymen. They were the Karens of the galaxy, wading through the river of Styx because the water didn't burn them. As they prepared for the return journey, Calith approached Thorn in the captain's ready room. The atmosphere was different now. The arrogance of the hegemony was gone from his posture. "Captain," he began, "I have analyzed the data from the encounter, the energy signatures of the Leviathans. They match the background radiation of the expanding void. They are not just predators, they are the immune system of a dying universe. And your species, you are the virus that survives the fever." Thorn laughed, a genuine, tired sound. "That's one way to put it. We prefer survivors." Calith hesitated. "When we return, the High Council will fear you. They will see what you did. They will see that you are stronger than the void. They might try to destroy you." Thorn stopped smiling. She leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening around her. "Let them try," Thorn said softly. "That's the thing about Death World's Inquisitor. They teach you that everything is trying to kill you. The weather, the beasts, the viruses, the neighbors. We've been fighting a war for survival since we crawled out of the mud. If your council wants to start a war with us, tell them to check the logs of this voyage. Tell them we hunted the ghosts in the dark and won. Tell them that while they were building spires to hide from the ground, we were digging trenches. We aren't the monsters, Calith. We're the ones you call when the monsters show up. But if you make us the enemy, you'll find out why the void didn't swallow us." The return to Xylar was swift. The Omen burst from the void, scarred but triumphant. The archive was delivered. The hegemony was saved. The trade routes could be stabilized using the new data. But the reception was not one of gratitude. It was one of terrified awe. The video logs of the bridge had been streamed to the council. They had seen the humans laughing in the face of madness. They had seen the hunters dismantling cosmic horrors with kinetic rounds and grit. Vrax stood in the council chamber, looking down at Thorn, but he did not look down with superiority anymore. He looked down with the wariness of a man who has realized he has a tiger in his living room. "The payment has been transferred," Vrax said, his voice lacking its usual boom. Thank you for your service, Captain Thorn. The arrangement is concluded." Thorn nodded, turning to leave. "Keep the change," she said. "We found what we were looking for." Vrax frowned. "The archive, but you gave it to us." Thorn paused at the door, looking back. "Not the archive, the map." She tapped her head. "We needed to map the currents of the void. We needed to know where the Leviathans were coming from." "Why?" Calith asked, stepping forward from the ranks of the stunned diplomats. "Why does Terra care about the geography of the void?" Thorn smiled, and for the first time it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile of terrible burden. "Because, Inquisitor, the void isn't just expanding naturally. It's being pushed. Something is driving those Leviathans toward your space. We've been tracking a signal for 50 years, a signal from the other side of the abyss. We used your ship to get close enough to triangulate it." The chamber went deathly silent. What is the signal?" Vrax whispered. Thorn pulled a small data chip from her pocket and tossed it to Calith. "It's not a distress beacon, it's a war drum. There's something waking up on the edge of the galaxy, something old. The precursors didn't die out, they ran away from it, and now it's found us." She looked around the hall at the thousands of trembling aliens, at the gold and the crystal and the fragility of their empire. "You used us for the dangerous ships because you thought we were expendable. But we used you to get a look at the enemy. The hunters of the world of death aren't just us, Chancellor. We're just the scouting party. The real war is coming, and you're going to need a lot more than dangerous ships to survive it." Thorn turned and walked out, her boots echoing on the polished stone. "We'll be in touch, start building more ships, and this time, put some real guns on them." The doors closed, leaving the High Council of the Ethel Guardian hegemony in silence. They looked at the star chart, at the red stain of the void. It no longer looked like a natural disaster. It looked like a mouth. And they realized with a dawning horror that froze their hearts that for all their ancient wisdom, for all their technology, they were merely the cattle in the field. The humans. The humans were the sheepdogs, and the wolves were almost at the gate. Calith clutched the data chip, looking at the door where the human had vanished. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not fear, it was hope. For in a universe of monsters, they finally had a monster of their own. Act 2, the unveiling of the architects. The silence that Thorn left behind did not last. It festered. Within hours of the Terran departure, the High Council was in an uproar, a chaotic swirling of accusations and panic that mirrored the storms of the gas giant below. Vrax attempted to maintain order, but his authority had been fractured by the revelation of his own helplessness. The video logs of the Omen's voyage were playing on loop in the analysis centers, dissected by every military strategist and xenopsychologist in the hegemony. They watched the humans move with that impossible fluidity. They watched the casual way they handled the conceptual weaponry of the Leviathans, and they realized that their classification of primitive was not just wrong, it was a fatal error of categorization. The humans were not primitive, they were specialized. Calith sat in his private sanctum, the data chip Thorn had thrown him resting on his desk like a loaded weapon. He had not yet decrypted it. He was afraid. He was a man of science, a believer in the rational progression of the universe, but the humans had introduced a variable that terrified him. The idea that the universe was not rational but hostile, and that survival required not understanding but violence. He activated his terminal, his slender fingers dancing over the holographic interface. "Decrypt," he whispered. The system word, the advanced quantum algorithms of the Zalarian computers chewing through the encryption. It took seconds. Terran encryption was robust, but mathematically simple compared to Zalarian ciphers, or so he thought. As the files opened, Calith expected coordinates, perhaps a tactical assessment. Instead, he found history. Not the history of the hegemony, but the history of Earth. He saw the wars, the genocides, the plagues. He saw a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing itself, only to stop, look up, and decide to kill everything else instead if it had to. But buried deeper in the files was the telemetry from the void. Thorn hadn't lied. The Leviathans were fleeing. There was a vector analysis showing the migration patterns of the void entities. They were running from a point in deep intergalactic space, a region of absolute zero where nothing should exist. And at the center of that dead zone, the humans had detected a heartbeat. A gravitational pulse, artificial, massive. Calith stood up, his chair clattering to the floor. He had to show this to Vrax, but before he could leave, his door chimed. It was Sub-Admiral Catho. The reptilian soldier looked haggard, his scales dull. "You have seen it?" Catho asked, not looking at the screen. "I have seen the logs, the humans. They interfaced with the precursor drives manually. Do you understand what that means, Inquisitor?" Calith nodded slowly. "It means their nervous systems are compatible with technology that hasn't existed for 1,000,000 years. It means," Catho corrected, stepping into the room, "that the precursor technology is not alien to them, or they are not alien to it." The implication hung in the air. "Convergent evolution," Calith suggested weakly. "Or ancestry," Catho growled. "The precursors were said to have seeded the galaxy before they vanished. They seeded worlds with the potential for intellect, but they also seeded worlds with the potential for war, failsafes, weapons left behind in biological form." Catho pointed a claw at the image of Thorn on the screen. "We thought they were mud dwellers. What if they are the biological equivalent of the dreadnoughts? What if Earth is not a mistake, but a factory? A factory for producing the pilots of the apocalypse?" The two aliens stared at each other, the political rivalry forgotten in the face of existential dread. "If that is true," Calith said, "then we have not hired mercenaries. We have activated the galaxy's defense system, and we have no idea how to turn it off." Meanwhile, on the edge of the system, the Omen, now technically the property of the hegemony again, though the humans had left their mark on it in the form of welded repairs and graffiti in the engine room, drifted in orbit. But the humans had not left on their shuttle. They had remained on their own ship, the Terran Aspiration, a cruiser that looked like a flying brick compared to the Zalarian spires. Thorn sat in her mess hall, surrounded by her crew. They weren't celebrating. They were debriefing. The atmosphere was somber. "The readings were off the charts, Captain," the science officer, a man named Chen, said, pushing a tablet across the metal table. "The entities in the void. They were reacting to us, not just attacking. They were testing our shielding. It felt coordinated." Thorn nodded, staring into her black coffee. "I felt it too. It wasn't random predation. It was a reconnaissance in force. Someone sent those things to see if the hegemony could fight back. And we showed them they could," Chen said. "Or rather, we showed them we could." "That's the problem," Thorn sighed. "We showed our hand. If the enemy is watching, they now know that Earth is active. They know the inheritors are awake." She looked around at H. Her crew, men and women who had grown up in the arcologies of Neo-Tokyo, the radiation zones of the American Midwest, the orbital slums of Mars. They were tough. They were scarred, but they were few. "We need the aliens," Thorn said firmly. "We can't fight this alone. We have the instinct, we have the grit, but we don't have the industrial capacity. The hegemony has 1,000 worlds. They have shipyards that can churn out a fleet in a month. We need to militarize them. We need to teach the pacifists how to bite." "They won't like it," the navigator muttered. "They think we're monsters." "Then we'll be the monsters," Thorn said, standing up. "We'll be the monsters that stand between them and the dark. Get me a line to High Chancellor Vrax. Tell him I'm coming back down, and tell him to bring his generals. School is in session." The second meeting in the High Council chamber was different. The air was not filled with disdain, but with a palpable tension, a mixture of fear and respect. When Thorn entered, she did not walk to the petitioner's circle. She walked straight to the strategic table, pushing a hologram of a trade route out of the way. Vrax watched her, his mandibles twitching, but he did not stop her. "You have new demands, Captain?" he asked. "Not demands, instructions," Thorn said. She keyed her datapad into the table, and the star map changed. The red infection of the void was replaced by a series of defensive lines, fortification rings around key star systems. "The entity you call the void is not a storm. It's a siege engine," Thorn began, her voice projecting clearly without the need for the translator's amplification. "And it's breaching the outer wall. You've been losing ships because you treat the void like a navigation hazard. You try to go around it or endure it. You need to treat it like an invasion." She pointed to the hologram. "Here, here, and here. These are choke points. Hyperspace lanes where the geometry forces ships to drop into real space. We need to build citadels here, fortresses." A gasp went through the room. "Militarize the trade lanes," a diplomat from the Merchant Guild cried out. "That violates the Treaty of Open Skies. It would disrupt commerce." Thorn turned on him, her eyes blazing. "There won't be any commerce if you're all dead. You think the void cares about your treaties? You think the things living in the dark care about your profit margins?" She slammed her hand on the table. "We faced 3 Leviathans on the Omen, 3. And we barely held them off with kinetic rounds and luck. The telemetry indicates there are thousands of them massing on the galactic rim, and behind them, something bigger." Vrax stepped forward, his shadow falling over the table. "You speak of the signal. Calith showed me. You believe an ancient intelligence is directing this." I don't believe I know, Thorn said. We've seen the ruins on the edge of our own space, smashed planets, Dyson spheres torn open like eggshells. Whoever they are, they harvest civilizations, and they're done with the outer rim. They're coming for the core, for you. Silence descended. The weight of her words pressed down on the ancient aliens. They were a people of peace, of commerce, of slow, methodical expansion. War to them was a failure of diplomacy. To hear that war was inevitable, that it was approaching like a tidal wave, was paralyzing. We do not know how to fight such a war, Vrax admitted, his voice low. Our fleets are for policing, our weapons are for deterrence, we do not have hunters. Thorn softened her expression. No, you don't, but you have us. We know how to build the weapons, we know how to train the soldiers, but we need your resources, we need your fabricators, your energy grids. She looked Vrax in the eye. Make us your war masters. Give the Terran Union command of the joint defense. We will provide the crews for the death ships. We will train your people to withstand the psychological pressure. We will turn this hegemony into a fortress. It was a staggering proposal, to hand over military command to a minor race, a species of barbarians. But Vrax looked at the map. He looked at the red tide, and he looked at the human woman who stood before him, small, fragile, yet radiating a ferocity that made his own carapace feel thin. If we do this, Vrax said, if we weaponize our society, will we not become like you? Will we not lose the light of our civilization? Thorn looked at him with a sadness that surprised him. Yes, she said simply. You will lose your innocence, you will learn to fear the dark, you will become harder, colder, but you will be alive, and that's the trade, that's always the trade. Act 3, the alliance of iron and glass. The transformation of the hegemony was painful. It was a cultural revolution forced by the barrel of a gun. Terran engineers flooded the shipyards of Xylar, ripping out luxury suites and installing redundant shield generators. Terran dry. LL sergeants barked orders at soft-shelled alien recruits, teaching them how to suppress their panic responses, how to focus through the fear. It was a clash of philosophies. The aliens wanted to discuss the ethics of violence. The humans wanted to discuss reload times. But slowly, a synthesis emerged. The aliens brought their superior technology, shields that could wrap a moon, energy lances that could pierce a star, and the humans brought their tactical madness. They built a new class of ship, the hybrid class. Beautiful, crystalline hulls reinforced with ugly, brutal Terran armor. AI cores shielded by human-designed analog breakers. And at the helm of every major vessel sat a human pilot or an alien who had undergone the grueling Terran conditioning program. A psychological boot camp designed to break the mind and rebuild it with scar tissue. The test came 6 months later. The void surged. It was not a raid this time. It was an incursion. A rift tore open in the Centauri sector, a wound in spacetime that bled shadow. From it poured the Leviathans, not in threes, but in hundreds. They swarmed the orbital defenses, their psychic screams driving the planetary populations into mass hysteria. The local garrisons, still unaccustomed to the new way of war, began to rout. Hold the line, Thorn's voice crackled over the fleet-wide comms. She was aboard the Aegis, the new flagship of the Joint Fleet, a monstrosity of engineering that was half cathedral, half bunker. Do not look at them, trust your sensors, fire on my mark. On the bridge of the Aegis, Vrax stood next to Thorn. He was wearing armor now, a ceremonial suit he hadn't worn in centuries. He was terrified. The view screen showed a wall of writhing darkness devouring the stars. They are too many, Vrax whispered. The simulation did not predict this density. Simulations are for people who want to be right, Thorn growled, her hands flying over the tactile controls she had insisted be installed. War is for people who want to be left. All ships engage ghost protocols. Divert all power to the mass drivers. We're going to punch a hole in that wall. The fleet engaged. It was a spectacle of light and shadow. The elegant beams of the Xylarian lances crossed with the brutal, invisible streaks of Terran kinetic rounds. The Leviathans screeched as they were torn apart, their energy dissipating into the void. But for every one that fell, 2 more emerged. They were pushing toward the planet below, a garden world of the Alari people. They're breaking through the left flank, Catho shouted from the tactical pit. The Alari ships are panicking, their psionic shields are failing. Thorn saw it. The Alari cruisers were drifting, their crews succumbing to the madness. The Leviathans were swarming them, feeding on their fear. We need to draw them off, Thorn said. We need bait. She looked at Vrax. The Aegis. It has the largest reactor signature. If we drive into the center of the rift, they'll swarm us. It will buy the flank time to regroup. Vrax looked at her. That is suicide. That's the job, Thorn said. Helm, full impulse, take us into the throat. The Aegis surged forward, leaving the formation. It was a moment of insanity that silenced the battlefield, a single ship charging an army of ghosts. The Leviathans turned, drawn by the massive energy output by the sheer audacity of the prey. They swarmed the Aegis, burying it in a cloud of darkness. Inside the ship, the alarms were a continuous scream. Hull integrity dropped, 80%, 60%. Thorn held the course. "Wait for it," she muttered. "Let them bunch up." "Shields failing," Vrax shouted, bracing himself against the console. "Thorn, we are going to die?" "Not yet," she said. She flipped a switch cover, revealing a red button, an ancient human mechanism. "Now detonate the pulse." The Aegis did not fire a gun. It screamed. A psionic amplifier built by Zalarian scientists but tuned to the frequency of a human death scream, a recording of raw, primal rage blasted out from the ship. It was not a weapon of mass destruction, but of mass disruption. The shockwave hit the Leviathans. To entities made of fear, the concentrated essence of human defiance was like acid. They recoiled, their forms destabilizing. The cloud broke. "All ships fire at will," Thorn commanded. The fleet, seeing their flagship emerge from the darkness like a vengeful god, rallied. They poured fire into the disorganized swarm. The Leviathans broke. They fled back into the rift, screeching in confusion and pain. The rift wobbled, then collapsed, sealing the wound. Silence returned to the Centauri sector. The Aegis drifted, its hull scorched, its sensors blind but alive. On the bridge, Vrax slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. He looked at Thorn. She was wiping blood from her nose, her hands shaking slightly. It was the first time he had seen her show physical weakness. "You," Vrax gasped. "You used yourself as a..." You channeled the psychic feedback through your own neural link to aim the pulse. Thorn nodded, taking a sip from a dented flask. "Had to make sure it hit the right frequency. Aliens, no offense. You don't know how to scream properly. You scream in fear, we scream in anger. There's a difference." Vrax looked at her with a new emotion, not respect, reverence. "You are not just hunters," he said softly. "You are the shield, you are the wall." The aftermath of the Battle of Centauri changed the galaxy. The hegemony was no more. It was replaced by the Galactic Alliance. Humans were no longer the mercenaries, they were the high marshals, but the victory was short-lived. The data recovered from the debris of the Leviathans confirmed Thorn's worst fears. The Leviathans were not the enemy, they were the hounds. The twist. A year later, the Alliance stood strong. Fortresses guarded the rifts. The economy was booming, driven by the war effort. Species that had once looked down on humans now emulated them. Fashion shifted to utilitarian human styles. Philosophy shifted from pacifism to armed vigilance. But Thorn, now admiral of the fleet, remained uneasy. She spent her nights in the deep space listening posts, monitoring the signal from the dark zone. It happened on a Tuesday, a standard rotation. Thorn was in the war room with Vrax and Calith. "The signal has changed," Calith said, his voice trembling. "It's no longer a pulse, it's a transmission, a linguistic pattern." "Can we translate it?" Vrax asked. "We already have," Thorn said, staring at the screen. She pressed a key. The voice that filled the room was not alien. It was not guttural or screeching. It was synthesized, calm, logical, and it spoke in a language that was undeniably rooted in mathematics, but the syntax. The syntax was eerily familiar to the humans. "To the entities inhabiting Sector 88Z, the voice intoned. "This is the Custodian Protocol. We have detected a Class 5 civilization event. You have successfully repelled the sterilization swarm. This indicates you have achieved a threshold of survival. We are pausing the reset cycle." The room went dead silent. "Reset cycle," Vrax whispered. "We are the architects," the voice continued. "We seeded your galaxy 4 billion years ago. The swarm is designed to harvest civilizations that become stagnant to clear the board for new growth. You have proven resistant. This is unexpected. The swarm was not fleeing, it was herding. We were herding you together to see if you would unite or die. You have united." Thorn felt a cold pit in her stomach. "It was a test," she whispered. "The whole damn thing, the void, the Leviathans, it was a stress test." "However," the voice went on, "survival of the swarm does not guarantee survival of the truth. We are approaching to verify your status. If you are deemed worthy, you will join the hierarchy. If you are deemed a threat, the swarm will be the least of your concerns. Arrival in T-100 cycles. Prepare your case." The transmission cut. Vrax looked at Thorn. The horror on his face was absolute. "The precursors, they didn't leave. They are the ones doing this. They are the gardeners, and we are the weeds they were trying to pull." He looked at the fleet hologram, at the mighty warships they had built, ships that suddenly felt like toys again. "What do we do, Thorn? How do we fight God?" Thorne stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the stars. She saw the fleet. The human ships, the alien ships, unified, strong. She thought of the world of death she came from. She thought of the ice ages, the plagues, the meteors. She thought of how every time the universe tried to kill humanity, humanity just got angrier and smarter. She turned back to the aliens, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. It was the smile of the hunter who has just realized the biggest game of all has just stepped into the clearing. "We don't fight God, Vrax," Thorne said, her voice hard as diamond. "We do what humans have always done when a landlord tries to evict us." She checked her sidearm. "We change the locks, and we wait by the door." The camera pulled back out of the station, out of the system, panning across the vast, glittering line of the Alliance fleet, a wall of metal and wills standing against the infinite dark. And in the silence of space, the message was clear. The galaxy was no longer a garden. It was a fortress, and the hunters of the world of death were waiting.